So here we go with part 2 of the Ickabog, chapter 4, The Quiet House. Mrs. Dovetail was buried in the graveyard in the city within the city where generations of royal servants lay. Daisy and her father stood hand in hand looking down at the grave for a long time. Bert kept looking back at Daisy as his tearful mother and grim-faced father led him slowly away. Bert wanted to say something to his best friend, but what had happened was too enormous and too dreadful for words. Bert could hardly bear to imagine how he'd feel if his mother had disappeared forever into the cold, hard earth. When all their friends had gone, Mr. Dovetail moved the purple wreath sent by the king away from Mrs. Dovetail's headstone and put in its place the small bunch of snowdrops that Daisy had collected that morning. Then the two Dovetails walked slowly home to a house they knew would never be the same again. A week after the funeral, the king rode out of the palace with the royal guard to go hunting. As usual, everyone along his route came rushing out into their gardens to bow, curtsy and cheer. As the king bowed and waved back, he noticed that the front garden of one cottage remained empty. It had black drapes at the windows and the front door. "Who lives there?" he asked Major Beamish. That's the Dovetail house, your Majesty," said Beamish. "Dovetail? Dovetail?" said the king, frowning. "I've heard that name, haven't I?" Yes, sire," said Major Beamish. "Mr. Dovetail is your Majesty's carpenter, and Mrs. Dovetail was your Majesty's head seamstress." "Ah, yes," said the king hurriedly. I remember." And spurring his milk-white charger into a canter, he rode swiftly past the black-draped windows of the Dovetail cottage, trying to think of nothing but the day's hunting that lay ahead. But every time the king rode out after that, he couldn't help but fix his eyes on the empty garden and the black-draped door of the Dovetail residence, and every time he saw the cottage, the image of the dead seamstress clutching that amethyst button came back to him. Finally, he could bear it no longer, and he summoned the chief adviser to him. "Herringbone," he said, not looking the old man in the eye, "there's a house on the corner, on the way to the park. Rather a nice cottage. Largest garden. The Dovetail house, your Majesty." "Oh, that's who lives there, is it?" said the king airily. "Well, it occurs to me that it's rather a big place for a small family. I think I've heard there are only 2 of them. Is that correct?" "Perfectly correct, your Majesty. Just 2, since the mother—" "It doesn't seem fair, Herringbone," King Fred said loudly, "for that nice spacious cottage to be given to only 2 people when there are families of 5 or 6, I believe, who'd be happy with a little more room." "You'd like me to move the Dovetails, your Majesty?" "Yes, I think so," said King Fred, pretending to be very interested in the tip of his satin shoe. "Very well, your Majesty," said the chief adviser with a deep bow. "I shall ask them to swap with the Roaches family, who I'm sure would be glad of more space, and I shall put the Dovetail in the Roaches' house." "And where is that exactly?" asked the king nervously, for the last thing he wanted was to see those black drapes even nearer the palace gates. "Right on the edge of the city within the city," said the chief adviser. "Very close to the graveyard. Sounds suitable," interrupted King Fred, leaping to his feet. "I have no need of details. Just make it happen, Herringbone. There's a good chap." And so Daisy and her father were instructed to swap houses with the family of Captain Roach, who, like Bert's father, was a member of the King's Royal Guard. The next time King Fred rode out, the black drapes had vanished from the door, and the Roach children, 4 strapping brothers, the ones who'd first christened Bert Beamish Butterball, came running into the front garden and jumping up and down, cheering and waving cornucopian flags. King Fred beamed and waved back at the boys. Weeks passed, and King Fred forgot all about the Dovetails and was happy again. For some time after Mrs. Dovetail's shocking death, the king's servants were divided into 2 groups. The first group whispered that King Fred had been to blame for the way she died. The second preferred to believe there'd been some kind of mistake, and that the king couldn't have known how ill Mrs. Dovetail was before giving the order that she must finish his suit. Mrs. Beamish, the pastry chef, belonged to the second group. The king had always been very nice to Mrs. Beamish, sometimes even inviting her into the dining room to congratulate her on particularly fine batches of Duke's Delights or Folderol fancies, so she was sure he was a kind, generous, and considerate man. "You mark my words, somebody forgot to give the king a message," she told her husband, Major Beamish. "He'd never make an ill servant work. I know he must simply feel awful about what happened." "Yes," said Major Beamish, "I'm sure he does." Like his wife, Major Beamish wanted to think the best of the king, because he, his father, and his grandfather before him had all served loyally in the Royal Guard. So even though Major Beamish observed that King Fred seemed quite cheerful after Mrs. Dovetail's death, hunting as regularly as ever, and though Major Beamish knew that the Dovetails had been moved out of their old house to live down by the graveyard, he tried to believe that the king was sorry for what had happened to his seamstress, and that he'd had no hand in moving her husband and daughter. The Dovetails' new cottage was a gloomy place. Sunlight was blocked out by the high yew trees that bordered the graveyard, although Daisy's bedroom window gave her a clear view of her mother's grave through a gap between dark branches. As she no longer lived next door to Bert, Daisy saw less of him in her free time, although Bert went to visit Daisy as often as possible. There was much less room to play in her new garden, but they adjusted their games to fit. What Mr. Dovetail thought about his new house or the king, nobody knew. He never discussed these matters with his fellow servants, but went quietly about his work, earning the money he needed to support his daughter and raising Daisy as best he could without her mother. Daisy, who liked helping her father in his carpenter's workshop, had always been happiest in overalls. She was the kind of person who didn't mind getting dirty, and she wasn't very interested in clothes. Yet, in the days following the funeral, she wore a different dress every day to take a fresh posy to her mother's grave. Whilst alive, Mrs. Dovetail had always tried to make her daughter look, as she put it, like a little lady, and made her many beautiful little gowns, sometimes from the offcuts of the material King Fred graciously let her keep after she'd made his superb costumes. And so a week passed, then a month, and then a year, until the dresses her mother had sewn were all too small for Daisy, but she still kept them carefully in her wardrobe. Other people seemed to have forgotten what had happened to Daisy, or had got used to the idea of her mother being gone. Daisy pretended she was used to it too. On the surface, her life returned to something like normal. She helped her father in the workshop, did her schoolwork, and played with her best friend Bert, but they never spoke about her mother, and they never talked about the king. Every night Daisy lay with her eyes fixed on the distant white headstone shining in the moonlight, until she fell asleep. Chapter 6. The Fight in the Courtyard. There was a courtyard behind the palace where the peacocks walked, fountains played, and the statues of former kings and queens kept watch. As long as they didn't pull the peacocks' tails, jump in the fountains, or climb the statues, the children of the palace servants were allowed to play in the courtyard after school. Sometimes Lady Islanda, who liked children, would come and make daisy chains with them. But the most exciting thing of all was when King Fred came out on the balcony and waved, which made all the children cheer, bow, and curtsy as their parents had taught them. The only time the children fell silent, ceased their games of hopscotch, and stopped pretending to fight the Ickabog was when the Lords Spittleworth and Flapoon passed through the courtyard. These two lords weren't fond of children at all. They thought the little brats made far too much noise in the late afternoon, which was precisely the time when Spittleworth and Flapoon liked to take their nap between hunting and dinner. One day, shortly after Bert and Daisy's 7th birthdays, when everyone was playing as usual between the fountains and the peacocks, the daughter of the new head seamstress, who was wearing a beautiful dress of rose-pink brocade, said, "Oh, I do hope the king waves at us today." "Well, I don't," said Daisy, who couldn't help herself and didn't realise how loudly she'd spoken. The children all gasped and turned to look at her. Daisy felt hot and cold at once, seeing them all glaring. "You shouldn't have said that," whispered Bert, as he was standing right next to Daisy and the other children were staring at him too. "I don't care," said Daisy, colour rising in her face. She'd started now, so she might as well finish. If he hadn't worked my mother so hard, she'd still be alive." Daisy felt as though she'd been wanting to say that out loud for a very long time. There was another gasp from all the surrounding children, and a maid's daughter actually squealed in horror. "He's the best king of cornucopia we've ever had," said Bert, who'd heard his mother say this so many times. "No, he isn't," said Daisy loudly. "He's selfish, vain, and cruel." "Daisy," whispered Bert, horrified, don't be silly." It was the word silly that did it. Silly when the new head seamstress's daughter smirked and whispered behind her hand to her friends while pointing at Daisy's overalls. Silly when her father wiped away his tears in the evenings thinking Daisy wasn't looking. Silly when to talk to her mother she had to visit a cold white headstone. Daisy drew back her hand and smacked Bert right around the face. Then the oldest Roach brother, whose name was Roderick, and who now lived in Daisy's old bedroom, shouted, "Don't let her get away with that, Butterball!" And all the boys in shouts of "Fight, fight, fight." Terrified, Bert gave Daisy's shoulder a half-hearted shove, and it seemed to Daisy that the only thing to do was to launch herself at Bert, and everything became dust and elbows until suddenly the two children were pulled apart by Bert's father, Major Beamish, who'd come running out of the palace on hearing the commotion to find out what was going on. "Dreadful behaviour," muttered Lord Spittleworth, walking past the Major and the two sobbing, struggling children. But as he turned away, a broad smirk spread over Lord Spittleworth's face. He was a man who knew how to turn a situation to good use, and he thought he might have found a way to banish children, or some of them anyway, from the palace courtyard. Chapter 7. Lord Spittleworth tells tales. That night the two lords dined as usual with King Fred. After a sumptuous meal of Baronstown venison, accompanied by the finest Jeroboam wine, followed by a selection of Kurdsburg cheeses and some of Mrs. Beamish's feather-like fairies' cradles, Lord Spittleworth decided the moment had come. He cleared his throat, then said, "I do hope, Your Majesty, that you weren't disturbed by that disgusting fight among the children in the courtyard this afternoon." "Fight?" repeated King Fred, who'd been talking to his tailor about the design for a new cloak, so he heard nothing. "What fight?" "Oh dear, I thought Your Majesty knew," said Lord Spittleworth, pretending to be startled. "Perhaps Major Beamish could tell you all about it." But King Fred was amused rather than disturbed. "Oh, I believe scuffles among children are quite usual, Spittleworth." Spittleworth and Flapoon exchanged looks behind the king's back, and Spittleworth tried again. "Your Majesty is, as ever, the very soul of kindness," said Spittleworth. "Of course, some kings," Flapoon muttered, brushing crumbs off the front of his waistcoat, "if they heard that a child spoke of the crown so disrespectfully—" "What's that?" exclaimed Fred, the smile fading from his face. "A child spoke of me disrespectfully?" Fred couldn't believe it. He was used to children shrieking with excitement when he bowed to them from the balcony. "I believe so, Your Majesty," said Spittleworth, examining his fingernails. "But as I mentioned, it was Major Beamish who separated the children. He has all the details." The candles sputtered a little in their silver sticks. "Children say all the manners of things in fun," said King Fred. "Doubtless the child meant no harm." "Sounded like bally treason to me," grunted Flapoon. "But," said Spittleworth fluffily, "it is Major Beamish who knows the details. Flapoon and I may perhaps have misheard." Fred sipped his wine. At that moment a footman entered the room to remove the pudding plates. "Cankerby," said King Fred, for such was the footman's name, "fetch Major Beamish here." Unlike the king and the two lords, Major Beamish didn't eat 7 courses for dinner every night. He finished his supper hours ago and was getting ready for bed when the summons from the king arrived. The Major hastily swapped his pyjamas for his new uniform and dashed back to the palace, by which time King Fred, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon had retired to the yellow parlour, where they were sitting on satin armchairs drinking more Jeroboam wine and, in Flapoon's case, eating a second plate of fairies' cradles. Ah, Beamish, said King Fred, as the Major made a deep bow. I hear there was a little commotion in the courtyard this afternoon. The Major's heart sank. He'd hoped that news of Bert and Daisy's fight wouldn't reach the King's ears. Oh, it was really nothing, Your Majesty, said Beamish. Come, come, Beamish, said Flapoon. You should be proud that you taught your son not to tolerate traitors. There was no question of treachery, said Major Beamish. They're only children, my lord. Do I understand that your son defended me, Beamish? Said King Fred. Major Beamish was in a most unfortunate position. He didn't want to tell the King what Daisy had said. Whatever his own loyalty to the King, he quite understood why the mother little girl felt the way she did about Fred, and the last thing he wanted was to get her into trouble. At the same time, he was well aware that there were 20 witnesses who could tell the King exactly what Daisy had said, and was sure that, if he lied, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon would tell the King that he, Major Beamish, who was also disloyal and treacherous. Yes, Your Majesty, it's true that my son Bert defended you, said Major Beamish. However, allowance must surely be made for the little girl who said the unfortunate thing about Your Majesty. She's passed through a great deal of trouble, Your Majesty, and even unhappy grown-ups may talk wildly at times. What kind of trouble has this girl passed through? Asked King Fred, who couldn't imagine any good reason for a subject to speak rudely of him. Her name is Daisy Dovetail, Your Majesty, said Major Beamish, staring at King Fred's head at a picture of his father, King Richard the Righteous. Her mother was the seamstress who... yes, I remember, said King Fred loudly, cutting Major Beamish off. Very well, that's all, Beamish, off you go. Somewhat relieved, Major Beamish bowed deeply again and had almost reached the door when he heard the King's voice. What exactly did the girl say? Major Beamish paused with his hand on the doorknob. There was nothing else for it but to tell the truth. She said that Your Majesty is selfish, vain, and cruel, said Major Beamish, not daring to look at the King as he left the room.